Hello, friends. Night has already fallen, and the day was long and tiring. And now, it is time to rest. As always, I will tell you a kind legend that once took place in our beloved Middle-earth. So, settle in comfortably, gently close your eyes, and let our journey begin. In the waning years of the Fourth Age, when the White City gleamed bright beneath the banners of the king, many believed that evil had perished from Middle-earth forever. The One Ring was destroyed, Barad-dûr cast down, and the Dark Lord Sauron swept away like smoke before a mighty wind. Yet, though his dominion was ended, and his servants scattered like ashes, not all his works were undone. Far to the east, beyond the plains of Gorgoroth and the broken gates of Mordor, where the black mountains sank into the wastes, there lingered a shadow. It was thin as mist and silent as the dead, but within it still burned a mind, a memory of command, and a thirst that no flame could quench. This was Khamûl, once second only to the Witch King of Ongmar, lieutenant of Sauron, and dread of the East. Long had he served beneath the Nine Rings, bound by the will of the Dark Lord. Yet when that will was shattered, Khamûl did not wholly pass away. His form was rent, his power broken, but his hatred endured. For what is a wraith but a spirit chained to longing? And Khamûl's longing was vengeance. He drifted through the dust of Mordor, where nothing grew and the air stank of burnt stone. The towers lay toppled, the orcs fled or slain, and the skies, once black with shadow, now bore faint traces of dawn. Khamûl hated the light. It burned him, made his formlessness ache. But still he endured it, for within that brightness walked those he despised most, the heirs of Númenor, the sons of the West. He remembered them, their bright blades and shining eyes, their songs that cut through darkness like bells of silver. He remembered their king, Aragorn, who had dared to claim Isildur's broken sword, and he remembered the ring-bearer, a halfling, small and trembling, yet strong enough to end Sauron's reign. Khamûl's hatred for them burned fiercer than the fires of Orodruin. He could not strike the king, nor the halfling, for they were beyond his reach. But there were others, lesser men, who served the same light. And one among them, rumor whispered, bore the blood of Númenor and walked often in the east. The new steward of Gondor, Faramir, son of Denethor. The name was like venom on his unseen tongue. Khamûl had faced the stewards once, long ago, when Gondor's borders stretched near to Mordor's edge. He remembered the fear in their hearts, the trembling in their voices when the Nazgûl rode. Now one of them ruled beside the king and dared to bring light into the lands of shadow that could not stand. For years, fragments of Sauron's armies had hidden in the cracks of the world. Orcs and men, faithless and afraid, who could not return to their homelands, for the West despised them, and the East no longer obeyed the voice of Mordor. Khamûl found them, one by one, whispering through their dreams. His voice seeped into their sleep like cold fog. Come to me, serve the shadow, avenge your master. They gathered in secret. 1,000 here, a few hundred there, orcs with broken armor, Easterlings who painted their faces with ash, and men who still bowed to the memory of the Dark Lord. They built their refuge in the southern reaches of Nurn, where black reeds grew around dead waters, and the land still bore the scars of fire. There, Khamûl began to take shape once more. His form was not the tall, dark majesty of the Nazgûl of old. He was dim and flickering, like a flame seen through smoke. Yet his presence chilled the heart and froze the marrow of any who came too near. He cloaked himself in a robe of shadow and crowned his unseen head with shards of iron from the ruins of Barad-dûr. When his followers beheld him, they fell to their knees. He spoke not often, for each word drew pain from the emptiness that was his body. But when he did, they trembled. "The world of men believes the shadow is gone," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "But we shall remind them. Their king sits upon his throne, blind to the east. We shall strike, and they shall know the Nine are not forgotten." The orcs howled in delight. The Easterlings pounded their spears upon the ground, and far away, in the marble halls of Minas Tirith, whispers of unrest in the east began to reach the king's ears. Aragorn listened gravely, his eyes darkening. He sent forth scouts, rangers of Ithilien, men of valor and silence, to seek the truth. Among them rode Faramir, for the king trusted no one more deeply. The steward departed with 50 men, riding east beneath the waning moon. Their cloaks were grey, their banners folded, and their hearts full of resolve. They knew that peace was fragile, and that evil often rose again where least expected. But none among them guessed what waited in the shadows of Nurn. As they crossed the plain of Gorgoroth, the wind carried strange whispers. Faramir felt them at the edge of hearing, a chill breath that seemed to call his name. He thought it memory or dream. But that night, as he looked toward the dark line of the mountains, he saw a faint light flicker among the ruins, a pale, flickering glow, like a lantern burning beneath the earth. He turned to his captain. "Do you see it?" he asked quietly. The man shook his head. "Nothing, my lord." Faramir frowned and said no more. Yet deep within, a shiver passed through him, cold as the touch of a ghost. In that same hour, miles away, upon a crumbling throne of black stone, Khamûl stirred. His eyeless gaze turned westward toward the approaching men of Gondor, and from his shadowed form came a whisper, soft as falling ash. "The line of the stewards returns to Mordor." His form rippled, stretching like smoke. "So be it. The hunt begins." Dawn came pale and uncertain over the ashen plains. The company of Gondor rode silently through the broken land where once Sauron's armies had marched in countless ranks. The air was dry and heavy, the wind sighing through jagged stones that gleamed like blackened teeth. Few birds flew there, and no living thing stirred save for the slow creep of smoke rising from fissures in the ground. Faramir rode at the head, his grey cloak drawn close, his eyes ever fixed upon the eastern horizon. He was older now than in the days of the War of the Ring, but his bearing remained noble and calm, his voice steady, though the land seemed cursed. The men who followed him trusted his quiet strength, for in his presence, fear diminished. They came upon the ruins of Durthang, an old fortress of the Dark Lord that once guarded the northern pass. Its gates lay broken, its towers tumbled, and its courtyards filled with creeping weeds that clung to the cracks like thin fingers. Here they made camp, for the horses were weary and the men hungered. As the campfires flickered against the black stones, Faramir sat apart, studying the maps laid before him. His captain, Baranor, approached with slow, cautious steps. "My lord," Baranor said, lowering his voice, "the scouts report strange signs near the Lake of Nurnen. There are footprints, many, but of no single kind. Orc, man, and beast, as if something gathers them." Faramir looked up sharply. "So the rumors are true. The darkness stirs again." "Aye," said Baranor, his hand unconsciously straying toward the hilt of his sword. "But no banners fly there, no colors, only a mark carved upon a stone, the eye defaced yet still, hateful to behold. Faramir's brow furrowed. "Destroy it at dawn. Let no such sign stand in these lands again." He dismissed the captain and gazed long into the night. The stars above Mordor were dim, veiled by drifting vapors, and in the silence between the gusts of wind he thought he heard again that faint whisper, the same that had troubled his dreams since they entered the east. It seemed to call not his name, but another, a word ancient and harsh, one he did not understand. Yet it filled him with unease. That night, the dream came again. He walked through the fields of Pelennor, yet all the flowers were withered, and the sky hung red as blood. From the shadow of the White Tower came a sound like weeping, and upon the throne of Gondor sat not Aragorn, but a figure robed in black, its face veiled, its hands pale and cold upon the armrests. When it raised its head, he saw not eyes but emptiness, two voids where light was swallowed whole. The figure spoke, and its voice was like iron scraping upon stone. "Son of Denethor," it said, "you took what was mine." Faramir awoke with a start. His heart thundered, and his breath came cold. The camp lay silent save for the low hiss of dying embers. Yet at the edge of the firelight he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the stones. He rose, sword in hand, and stepped forward. "Who goes there?" No answer came. The shadow was gone. Only the wind moaned through the broken gate. When morning came, they broke camp and moved eastward, down into the valleys where once the slaves of Nurn had toiled. The land was bleak but not dead. Here and there small green shoots pushed through the ashes, stubborn remnants of life. Yet as they drew nearer to the southern marshes, the ground grew treacherous, and a strange stillness hung upon the air. Then, near midday, one of the scouts returned at a gallop, his face pale as bone. "My lord!" he cried. "An ambush! They came out of the reeds, orc kind and men together. Our forward riders are cut off." Faramir drew his sword. "Sound the horn. To me." The men formed ranks swiftly, shields locking tight as dark figures emerged from the mist. They were twisted creatures, some bearing the crude armor of orcs, others the red-stained mail of Easterlings. And behind them, upon a low ridge, stood a figure swathed in black, half shrouded by the haze. Though it had no face, the air about it shimmered with dread. Horses reared and men trembled as the shadow raised an arm. Khamûl had come. His voice cut through the din like a blade of ice. "Men of Gondor, the West has forgotten you, but I remember." The air thickened. A wave of terror washed through the company. Some fell to their knees, gasping, while others dropped their weapons and fled into the reeds. Faramir alone held firm, though his blood turned to frost within him. He lifted his blade high. "By the grace of the King Elessar, and by the light of the West, you shall not have this land again." A faint laugh, hollow and distant, came from the wraith. "Your king cannot save you. His crown is of dust. His throne will burn." Then the battle broke. Orcs charged howling through the mire, arrows hissing from their bows. Gondorian steel met them with a clash that rang across the dead plain. Faramir fought at the front, his sword flashing silver. His men rallied to him, their courage kindled by his voice. But wherever the wraith passed, despair followed. Men's arms grew heavy, their sight dimmed. Faramir felt it too, a pressure upon his mind, a weight that sought to bend his will. Through the veil of fear, he saw the Nazgûl's form waver, half there, half not, like smoke twisting in a wind unseen. He took a step forward, calling out, "You are nothing now, Shadow. The ring is gone." Khamûl's answer was a shriek that split the sky. The horses screamed, the reeds bent as if from a storm, and from the wraith's tattered sleeves burst a torrent of black mist, cold and biting. It swept across the field, searing the flesh of those it touched. Baranor, the captain, fell before it, clutching his throat as frost gathered upon his armor. Faramir leapt to his side, but when he looked up, the wraith had vanished, melted into the fog. The orcs began to retreat, dragging their wounded into the marshes. Silence settled, broken only by the cries of the dying. Faramir knelt beside Baranor, whose eyes stared blankly toward the grey sky. A single breath escaped the captain's lips. It was him, my lord. One of the 9. Then he was still. Faramir bowed his head, sorrow and dread warring within him. Then the darkness truly stirs again, he murmured. He ordered the wounded tended and the fallen buried. But as night fell over the battlefield, he stood alone upon the ridge where Khamûl had stood, staring eastward into the endless black. The stars were hidden behind drifting clouds, and far away, beyond sight, a low whisper coiled through the air, colder than any wind. The hunt has only begun. Faramir did not hear it with his ears, but in his soul he felt the chill of it, deep and lingering. And though he knew not yet what evil sought him, he swore silently before the heavens that it would not claim the lands of men again. Still, a doubt crept into his heart, a fear older than the memory of war. For if even one of the 9 still walked the world, what else might remain in the dark? The company of Gondor lingered long upon the fields of Nurn, their banners hanging limp in the still air. The dead were buried beneath stones gathered from the ruins, and the wounded lay in silence, wrapped in what cloth could be found. The battle had cost them dearly, too dearly, Faramir thought. Of 50 men who had ridden from Minas Tirith, fewer than 30 now stood, and their hearts were heavy with fear. The steward of Gondor walked among them, offering words of comfort, yet even his calm voice could not wholly still the unease that crept through the camp like a chill mist. For each man had seen something, felt something, in that battle which mortal eyes were not meant to behold. A shadow that had no body, a voice that pierced the mind rather than the ear. And though the wraith had vanished, its presence lingered, clinging to the land and to the thoughts of those who had faced it. That night, the wind rose again, sighing through the reeds and rattling the spears that stood in the earth. Faramir sat beside the low campfire, his sword across his knees, gazing into the shifting flames. Each flicker seemed to shape itself into faces, grim, pale, and fleeting. The firelight bent and wavered, as though the very air around him resisted warmth. At last, unable to bear the restless stillness, he rose and walked beyond the circle of light, down toward the edge of the marsh. The moon hung low, its reflection wavering upon the dark water. The scent of rot and ash mingled upon the wind. Then he heard it, a faint splash, followed by a whisper. He turned swiftly, hand upon his hilt, and saw a figure standing upon the far bank. It was a man, tall and cloaked, yet his face was hidden beneath a hood. The stranger did not move, only watched. Faramir's voice carried low and firm across the water. "Who are you that wander in the lands of Mordor unbidden?" The figure tilted its head, and when it spoke, the voice was soft and strange, as though carried from a great distance. One who remembers what should have been forgotten. Before Faramir could speak again, a gust of wind swept across the marsh, lifting the reeds in a whispering dance. When it died, the figure was gone. He stood long upon the bank, his heart heavy with foreboding. He knew now that the shadow they faced was no mere remnant of Sauron's armies, but something older, bound by will and vengeance. When he returned to the camp, his men looked upon him anxiously. "The dead stir in these lands," said one, his voice trembling. I heard footsteps beyond the firelight, but there was nothing to see. Faramir laid a steadying hand upon the man's shoulder. "Fear them not. Whatever stalks us here, it can be faced. We have light, and light is what the shadow fears most." He spoke the words with conviction, yet in his heart he wondered if it were still true. In the days that followed, the company pressed onward, seeking the heart of the darkness. The trail of the enemy led them through blackened gullies and over silent hills where the ground was pitted with the remains of old fires. Often they found crude camps, torn banners, half-burned torches, bones gnawed by orcs. But there were also signs that something more cunning directed these creatures now. The remnants of armor, reforged with purpose, weapons carved with the mark of the eye, struck through by a single slash. One evening, as the sun bled red upon the horizon, they came to the ruins of a great stone bridge spanning a chasm. Below, a dark river ran slow and heavy, whispering against its jagged banks. The bridge was broken in the middle, the gap wide enough to swallow a cart whole. They halted there, uncertain. Baranor had once spoken of such a place, a crossing that led toward the old roads of Nurn, where once slaves had been driven toward the fields. Faramir studied the far bank. Amid the tumbled stones, something glimmered faintly, like metal catching the last of the light. He turned to his archers. "Loose a shaft there," he said. An arrow flew and struck stone. The sound echoed unnaturally, ringing long after it should have died. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Then, from the shadows beyond the far side, came laughter, low, mocking, inhuman. A figure stepped into view, tall and thin, clad in blackened mail. His face was hidden beneath a helm of iron, and in his hand he bore a long, cruel blade. "Welcome, sons of Gondor," the stranger called. "Have you come to reclaim what your fathers lost?" Faramir's hand tightened upon his sword. "Name yourself, if you are not too craven to do so." The figure tilted his head, and in the deepening dusk, his eyes glowed faintly red. "Names are for the living. I serve the Lord of Shadows, and his will still binds me." With that, the figure lifted his sword and struck it against the stone. A great sound filled the air, and from the darkness behind him poured a host of shapes, orc kind, men with painted faces, creatures that shunned the light. "Hold the line!" Faramir cried, drawing his blade. The Gondorians set their shields as the horde swarmed toward the gap. Arrows flew, clattering against armor. Spears thrust and swords flashed. The chasm echoed with the roar of battle. Faramir fought at the front once more, each stroke of his sword driven by the will to protect what was left of the peace they had won. He struck down one foe after another, yet more came, crawling over their fallen. Then he saw the black-clad captain again, standing upon the far edge of the bridge. The man's voice rose above the clamor. "Your king will fall, the White City will burn, the shadow rises anew." But before Faramir could answer, a cold mist swept over the chasm. The air turned heavy, and the enemy faltered, falling to their knees. The sound of iron upon stone faded, replaced by a whisper, a voice that all had heard once before. It came from the mist, deeper and more dreadful than thunder. "You dare stand against me again, son of Denethor? You who should have perished with your house?" A darkness gathered upon the far bank, coalescing into the tall, shrouded form of Khamûl. His robes writhed like smoke, and from beneath his hood came a faint blue light. The echo of eyes long lost. The men of Gondor fell back in terror, clutching their ears as the wraith's voice filled their minds. Only Faramir held his ground, though sweat beaded upon his brow. He raised his sword, its edge glimmering with the faint blessing of Mithrandir's enchantments. "You are bound to nothing now," he said, his voice clear though the air shuddered around him. "Your master is gone, and your power with him." Camul's laughter was a sound of dry leaves twisting in fire. "Gone? No, steward. He is merely waiting." With that, the wraith swept his arm forward, and the mist surged like a living thing. The bridge shuddered, stones cracking beneath the force. Faramir's men stumbled backward, calling out in fear. But the steward stood unmoving, his sword raised high. The light upon its blade brightened until it burned white, and for a moment the darkness wavered. Camul recoiled, his form flickering like a dying flame. Yet before he vanished, his voice whispered through the storm, "You cannot kill what death has already claimed." Then the shadow withdrew, leaving silence in its wake. The enemy broke, fleeing into the wilds, their cries echoing down the chasm. When it was over, Faramir sank to one knee, breathing hard. The bridge lay in ruins, the last of its stones crumbling into the dark river below. He looked eastward, where the mist was thinning, and a grim resolve filled his heart. "This will not end here," he murmured. "We will hunt the shadow to its source, for Gondor and for the light that endures." And though the men gathered around him bowed their heads in weary reverence, none spoke, for each of them knew that they now walked a path that led deep into the heart of darkness itself. The dawn that followed was a dim and colorless thing, rising pale and thin through the tattered clouds above the plains of Nirn. The men of Gondor stood amidst the ruin of the broken bridge, their armor smeared with ash and blood, their hearts heavy with dread. The echoes of the wraith's laughter still lingered in the wind, faint but unforgotten. Faramir ordered what remained of his company to rest upon the higher ground, where they could see far across the waste. A few men were sent to gather water from a nearby stream, though they did so with caution, for the land seemed watchful, as if eyes unseen followed every step. The scent of iron and decay lay thick upon the air. The steward himself stood apart, gazing eastward where the shadow had withdrawn. His thoughts were restless, filled with memories of the ancient tales, of the 9 rings, of the fall of Númenor, and of the long war that had finally ended upon the slopes of Orodruin. Yet the past, it seemed, was not content to rest. He knelt, brushing aside the black dust at his feet. There, upon a fallen stone, he found a mark, 3 slashes carved deep, forming the shape of a crown turned upside down. Beneath it, the faint trace of runes in the tongue of Mordor. He could not read them, yet he knew their meaning. They were a sign of fealty, not to Sauron, but to one who claimed his shadow. He rose slowly. "The enemy gathers still," he murmured, "but he builds his strength not for open war. He hunts as wolves do when the night is long." As he turned, one of his scouts came running, breathless. "My lord, smoke rises from the east. A village burns." Faramir's heart tightened. "A village? There are no villages left in this land." "There are now," said the scout. "Men and women of the freed folk, those who once tilled the fields of Norn. They have returned, my lord. They rebuild where the slaves once dwelt." Faramir's eyes darkened. "Then we ride. If they burn, we cannot stand idle." Within the hour, the company mounted and set forth, their banners rolled, their weapons ready. They followed the rising column of smoke that stained the sky. The land grew rougher as they went, the soil cracked and veined with old fire. The path wound through gullies and over barren hills, until, at last, they beheld the village below. It lay beside a dried riverbed, little more than a cluster of huts built from timber and stone. Flames leapt high from the thatched roofs, and dark figures moved among the firelight, orc-kind and wild men, hacking down those who fled. Faramir did not hesitate. "For Gondor!" he cried, spurring his horse forward. The men followed, their horns ringing clear and fierce. They swept down upon the raiders like a storm, steel flashing in the firelight. The battle was swift but bitter. Orcs fell beneath the swords of the Dunedain, yet they fought with a strange fury, as though driven by a power unseen. When at last the last of them lay slain, Faramir dismounted and walked among the smouldering ruins. The air reeked of smoke and death. Among the ashes he found the survivors, few and broken. A woman, her face streaked with soot, knelt beside the body of a child. She lifted her eyes to Faramir's face. "They came in the night," she whispered. "There was no warning. They said a great lord of the east had returned, that the darkness would rise again. We begged them to spare us. They only laughed." Faramir knelt beside her. "You are safe now. Gondor stands with you." But even as he spoke, he knew the words felt hollow. There were too many dead, and the ground itself seemed poisoned by grief. As his men tended the wounded and doused the flames, Faramir searched the wreckage. In the largest hut, he found what had once been a place of worship. Upon the earthen floor lay a crude altar, stones arranged in a circle, stained black. Upon it, a single object remained, a fragment of a crown wrought from dark metal, its edges jagged, as if torn apart. He lifted it carefully, and as he did, the air grew colder. A faint whisper touched his mind, low and poisonous. "The crown is broken, but the hand that bore it still rules." He dropped it quickly, drawing a sharp breath. The metal fell to the floor with a dull ring, and the sound seemed to linger far longer than it should. Baranor, who had come to stand beside him, looked at him with concern. "My lord?" Faramir straightened. "It is nothing," he said, though the lie tasted bitter. "Take what survivors remain. We march north. The enemy moves in secret, and we must find his lair before his strength grows." That night, they camped upon a hill overlooking the smoking ruins. The men were weary, their faces grey with soot and sorrow. No one sang. Only the crackle of the fires and the murmur of the wind broke the silence. Faramir sat apart once more, his gaze upon the stars that struggled through the veil of cloud. They seemed dimmer than he remembered, as though the heavens themselves had turned their faces from the east. He thought of the words of Mithrandir in years long past. Evil does not die. It only sleeps, waiting for the hearts of men to grow weary. And weary, he thought, many hearts had grown. When the watch was set and all was quiet, he closed his eyes. For a time, he drifted in uneasy sleep. Then he dreamed again. He stood upon a plain of black glass, vast and silent. In the distance, a single tower rose, its peak crowned with flame. From its summit came a voice, a whisper and a roar in one. "You cannot hide from me, son of the steward. Your house took from mine that which was not theirs. The fire remembers. The ring remembers. You shall not have peace until the debt is paid." The voice grew until it filled the world, and the tower burst apart in fire. From the flames stepped a figure cloaked in shadow, a crown of shards upon his head. Faramir woke with a cry, his body drenched in sweat. The fire before him had burned low, leaving only embers. Yet the cold that clung to him was not of night. It was the touch of something far older. From the darkness beyond the camp came a faint sound, the clink of metal, the whisper of footsteps. Faramir's hand went to his sword. "Who walks?" he called. No answer. Only silence. Then, upon the wind, came the faintest of murmurs, a voice he knew too well, though it came from no living throat. "The crown will rise again." Faramir's grip tightened upon his hilt, and he whispered into the shadows, "Not while the sons of Gondor still draw breath." But the wind carried back only laughter, soft, distant, and cold as the grave. Morning broke, grey and soundless, over the hills of Nirn. A light mist clung to the blackened earth, coiling about the feet of men and horses like the last breath of the dead. Faramir stood upon the ridge above the smouldering village, the wind stirring the dark hair upon his brow. Below him, the camp was stirring to life. The wounded were tended, the dead wrapped in cloaks and laid in rows for burial. There was no song, no voice raised in prayer. The land itself seemed to forbid it. Faramir's heart was heavy. The wraith's presence hung upon the air still, faint but near, like a memory that refused to fade. He had seen the enemy's cunning in the slaughtered villagers, the cruelty of the raid, the deliberate ruin of every hopeful thing that had begun to grow in Mordor's ashes. The shadow did not seek conquest yet. It sought despair, and despair was a poison that worked swiftly. He descended into the camp, where Baranor awaited him beside the morning fires. The captain's face was drawn and pale. "The men are weary, my lord," he said. "They will follow you, but their strength fades. We have lost too many, and some speak of turning back." Faramir regarded him steadily. "We cannot turn back while evil rises again. The king himself would ride, were he not bound to his throne. We are his hand, Baranor, and the hand of Gondor does not falter." The captain bowed his head, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Faramir turned his gaze eastward. The wraith drives the orcs and men before him, yet he does not strike openly. There must be a place, some hidden lair where his power gathers. We will find it before it finds us. At that moment, a young scout approached, his cloak torn and his eyes wide with fear. "My lord, there is something in the hills to the north, a fortress, or what remains of one. Smoke rises from its towers." "Then that is where we go," Faramir said. They set forth by mid-morning, leaving the burnt village behind them. The road wound through jagged slopes and clefts of stone where no grass grew. The air grew colder and the light dimmer, though no cloud passed the sun. Each step carried them deeper into the silence of a land long cursed. By evening, they came upon the ruins. It was no simple fortress, but the remains of a citadel vast and ancient, half buried beneath the mountain's flank. The walls, though broken, still loomed like black cliffs, and a wide gate stood open, its iron doors rusted but unfallen. Faramir felt a chill pass through him as he gazed upon the carvings that adorned the gate, serpents twined with crowns, and beneath them the faint traces of runes once used by the men of Rhûn. "This was no work of Sauron's," he said softly. "It is older, built before the dark years, when men of the East first bowed to the shadow." Baranor's hand went to his sword. "Then we should not linger here." "Nor should we flee," Faramir replied. "If Khamûl seeks to rule again, it will be from such a place as this." They entered warily, torches raised high. The courtyard beyond was wide and strewn with rubble. Shattered statues lay half buried in the dust, their faces worn away by time. A foul smell lingered in the air, like rot and damp stone. They moved through the ruins in silence until they reached what had once been the Great Hall. The roof was broken, and the pale light of evening spilled through the cracks. In the center stood an altar of black marble, veined with crimson. Upon it rested a single object, a helm wrought in the likeness of a crown, its surface dark and glimmering faintly with an inner light. Faramir approached slowly, his torchlight dancing upon the metal. A low whisper filled his ears, so faint he thought it the wind. "Kneel, son of Gondor. The crown is yours by right of blood." He froze, his hand tightening upon the hilt of his sword. The voice was smooth and insidious, carrying a strange allure. Baranor stepped forward. "My lord, do not—" The words died upon his lips. The torches flickered, the shadows deepened, and from every corner of the hall came the sound of rustling, as though unseen wings stirred in the dark. Then, from behind the altar, the air began to shimmer. A shape emerged, a figure tall and robed in black, its presence sucking the warmth from the air. Khamûl stood before them once more. His form was clearer than before, almost solid, the faint outline of armor visible beneath the shroud. His voice, when he spoke, was the hiss of steel drawn slowly from its sheath. "You trespass upon the throne of the East, heir of Denethor. I offered you mercy once. Do not spurn it again." Faramir lifted his sword, though his hand trembled slightly. "Mercy is not found in the mouth of the Nazgûl." The wraith's laughter was like a storm against stone. "You think the king's light will shield you? You think the ring's fire consumed all that was? Fool. Shadows do not die. They change. You stand in the heart of mine." The torches flared and went out. Darkness rushed upon them like water from a broken dam. Men shouted, blades rang, and a cold wind howled through the hall. Faramir saw Baranor fall, clutching at his throat as frost bloomed across his armor. He swung his sword, and where its light struck, the dark recoiled, but only for a breath. Then he felt it, the wraith's presence pressing upon his mind, cold and inexorable. It spoke not with words, but with will, forcing its way into his thoughts. "Serve me. Gondor will fall, and you shall rule what remains. The White Tower for the Black Crown, the blood of the steward for the return of kings." Faramir staggered, his vision dimming, the edges of the world blurred. In that moment, he saw his father, Denethor, standing upon the pyre, the madness in his eyes. "Do not take my house into shadow again," he whispered. Summoning all his strength, he drove his sword forward. Its blade struck the altar, shattering the helm in two. A scream tore through the hall, not of pain, but of fury. The wraith's form writhed, twisting like smoke in a gale. Light flared from the broken helm, white and blinding. When it faded, the shadow was gone. Only ashes remained where Khamûl had stood. The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Faramir stood trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, the surviving men stirred, shaken but alive. Baranor, pale but still breathing, rose with effort. "Is it done?" he asked hoarsely. Faramir looked to the ashes that smoldered upon the altar. "No," he said softly. "The darkness is wounded, but not slain. The wraith has fled again." He turned his eyes toward the east, where the mountains loomed in shadow. Somewhere beyond them, he knew, the spirit of Khamûl would gather its strength once more. Yet for the first time, a glimmer of hope stirred in his heart. For the crown of the shadow was broken, and the courage of men had not failed. "Come," he said to his men, "let us return to the light while it yet endures." And together, weary but unbroken, they left the ruined fortress behind them. But as they descended into the valleys below, unseen upon the wind, a whisper followed them, soft, hateful, and unyielding. "The crown will rise again." The company rode westward beneath a sky of tarnished silver. A chill wind swept across the plains of Nirn, bending the reeds and scattering the ashes that forever clung to the air. Behind them, the ruins of the black citadel lay silent, swallowed once more by shadow and dust. The men spoke little as they rode. Weariness was in their limbs and sorrow in their hearts, yet Faramir's gaze remained unbroken, his mind fixed upon the path ahead. 3 days had passed since their battle in the fortress of the east. The wound they had dealt to the wraith had not brought peace. Rather, it had stirred something deeper, a restlessness in the land itself. The nights grew longer and the stars dimmer, as though a veil had fallen over the sky. In their dreams, the men heard whispering voices, faint and cold, calling them by name. Faramir too dreamed, though he did not speak of it. In his sleep, he saw again the crown of shards he had shattered. The fragments floated in darkness, each piece glowing with a dull red light. From their midst rose a hand, pale and terrible, reaching upward toward the unseen heavens. The crown will rise again. The words burned through his mind, and each time he woke with a start, his hand upon his sword, though no enemy stood before him. On the 4th morning, Baranor rode beside him. The captain's armor bore the scars of battle, and his face was gaunt from sleepless nights. "My lord," he said, his voice low, "we should turn back. The men are afraid. They whisper that we walk beneath a curse." Faramir's eyes remained on the horizon. "The curse was here long before we came. If we turn away, it will follow us to Gondor's gates. Better to face it where it hides, than wait for it to find us unguarded." Baranor bowed his head, though unease lingered in his expression. By midday they came upon a valley of black stone, where an ancient road wound like a scar between cliffs. Strange carvings marked the rock, circles, runes, and faded symbols of the east. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old fire. It was there they found the signs of recent passage, footprints of men and beasts, and the remains of campfires burned low. "They move north," said one of the scouts, kneeling beside the tracks, "perhaps toward the Sea of Nurnen." Faramir nodded. "Then we follow. If Khamûl gathers his strength anew, we must end it before it spreads." The valley grew darker as they advanced, the cliffs rising high above them. At times, the wind carried faint sounds, the echo of drums, or perhaps the beating of wings. The men tightened their grips upon their weapons, and their eyes darted to every shadow. When night fell, they made camp in a hollow, sheltered by stone. Fires were lit, but their light did little to banish the gloom. Faramir stood upon the ridge, keeping watch. The moon hung low, a pale shard above the peaks, its light silvering the ground. All seemed still, yet the stillness felt wrong, too deep, too deliberate. Then he heard it, a soft sound, distant but growing nearer. The scrape of metal upon stone, the clatter of hooves, though no horses were near. He drew his sword and turned toward the sound. Out of the darkness beyond, the ridge came a shadow, a figure cloaked in black, its shape indistinct. Behind it, more shadows moved, silent as the dead. "Form ranks!" Faramir shouted. The men leapt to their feet, shields raised, blades drawn. The firelight flickered wildly, casting long, leaping shadows across the stones. Then from the gloom came the first attack, arrows hissing through the night, striking shields and armor. "Hold the line!" cried Baranor. "For Gondor!" The enemy surged forward, orc kind and men of the east, their eyes glinting with madness. They fell upon the Gondorians with a fury that seemed beyond mortal will. Faramir fought at the front, his sword flashing like lightning, each stroke felling an enemy. But the tide did not lessen. Through the chaos he saw it, the wraith half-formed and drifting like smoke above the ground. Its voice cut through the battle, filling every ear. "You cannot destroy what death itself obeys. The crown will rise. The Steward will kneel." A chill swept through the ranks. Men faltered, their courage bending beneath the weight of that terrible sound. Faramir pressed forward, calling out, "Stand fast! You are men of the West. The shadow cannot claim what has already seen the dawn." For a heartbeat, his voice steadied them. The men rallied, striking back with renewed strength. Yet the Wraith's power grew. The very air thickened with cold. Torches dimmed and were snuffed out. Frost crept across blades and armor. Then, with a shriek that split the night, Khamûl descended. His form was no longer a mere ghost. It had gathered shape and strength from the blood spilled upon the ground. He towered above them, his cloak a storm of darkness, his unseen eyes burning like distant stars. Faramir met him, blade to blade. The sound of their clash rang through the valley like thunder. Each strike sent sparks flying, though one sword was of steel and the other of shadow. Faramir's arms trembled beneath the force of the blows, yet he did not yield. "Your master is gone," he cried, "and you are nothing without him." Khamûl's voice was a whisper and a roar in one. "Gone? You think the eye saw only the ring? He saw all. His will endures through me, and through you, if you would but accept it." Faramir staggered as the Wraith's hand touched his chest. The cold pierced him to the heart. For a moment, the world spun, the battlefield fading, the cries of men growing distant. He saw visions, the White City burning, the king fallen upon his throne, the river Anduin black with ash, and upon the tower of Ecthelion stood Khamûl, crowned in flame. But deep within that vision, another voice spoke, a memory, faint but steadfast. "There is always light, even in the shadow. Seek it, son of Gondor." It was his father's voice, not the voice of madness that had consumed Denethor, but the voice of the man Faramir had once loved, the voice of wisdom long buried beneath grief. With a cry, Faramir tore free of the Wraith's grip. He drove his sword upward, the blade gleaming white as if the very stars had answered. It struck the Wraith's chest, and from that wound burst a torrent of black flame. Khamûl screamed, the sound echoing off the cliffs like the breaking of iron. His form split and scattered, fragments of shadow torn away into the wind. The remaining enemy fled into the night, their courage broken. When silence returned, Faramir fell to one knee, gasping. The cold still clung to him, but it no longer pierced. Baranor came to his side, bleeding but alive. "My lord," he said, voice trembling. "Is it done?" Faramir looked toward the east, where the first faint glow of dawn touched the sky. "No," he whispered. "The shadow is broken but not gone. Yet we have shown it that men do not bow so easily." He rose slowly, sheathing his sword. Around him his men gathered, few now, weary and blood-stained, yet still standing. The sun crept over the horizon, pale and weak, but enough to chase the last of the mist. And though the valley lay strewn with the dead, the light seemed to linger a moment longer upon the banners of Gondor, fluttering in the wind. Far off, beyond the mountains, a whisper stirred, faint, bitter, unyielding. "The crown will rise again." But for that morning, the east was silent, and in that silence, Faramir allowed himself one deep breath of hope. When dawn's light finally reached the valley, it revealed a battlefield draped in mist and silence. The air was still heavy with the scent of smoke and steel, and the ravens had already come, circling high above the broken ground. Faramir stood among the dead, his armor dented, his cloak torn, his eyes weary but clear. Around him, the surviving men of Gondor worked in grim silence, gathering the fallen and tending the wounded. None spoke of victory, for the victory was small, and the shadow of it long. The wraith was gone, or so it seemed. The sun, pale though it was, shone upon the cliffs, driving the chill from the stones. Yet even as the warmth touched his face, Faramir felt no peace. Deep within, he knew that Camul was not destroyed. Wraiths were not so easily unmade. Their essence clung to the world like smoke to fire. By noon the dead were buried, their graves marked with simple cairns of stone. Faramir spoke the words of farewell himself, his voice low but steady. May the Valar guard your rest. Your valor is not forgotten, and your names shall live in the songs of Gondor. The wind carried his words across the empty plain, and for a moment the men found strength in them. But when all was done, and the camp was broken, silence returned, heavy and watchful. The company moved northward again, following the road that curved through the broken hills. The light faded early that day, the sky darkening with clouds that came rolling out of the east. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and before long the rain began to fall, cold, sharp, and relentless. The men drew their cloaks tight and pressed on, the sound of their boots lost beneath the downpour. Faramir rode at the head, his thoughts far away. He could not forget the wraith's words, nor the visions it had shown him. The white city burning, the crown of shards reforged in fire. He told himself they were lies meant to break his will, yet part of him feared they were warnings of things yet to come. That night they sought shelter in the ruins of an old watchtower, one of many built in the forgotten wars of Gondor's past. The roof was gone, and the stones were slick with rain, but it was dry enough beneath the fallen beams to keep a small fire. The men huddled close, their faces drawn, their armor glinting faintly in the firelight. Baranor approached Faramir as he sat apart, sharpening his blade. "The men are near spent, my lord," he said quietly. "They will follow you still, but they need rest. And food, if there is any left to find in this cursed land." Faramir nodded, his gaze on the fire. "We will rest tomorrow. The rain will hide us from the eyes of the enemy, if any yet hunt us. And when the storm clears, we ride west, back to Ithilien. Gondor must know what stirs here." Baranor hesitated. "You think the wraith will follow?" Faramir sheathed his sword and looked toward the dark horizon. "He has followed me since the ring was destroyed. He will not rest until he has what he seeks. But neither shall I." That night, Faramir dreamed again. He walked through the courts of Minas Tirith. The white tree stood tall before him, its leaves glimmering with silver light. Yet as he drew near, he saw that its bark was blackened, its roots coiled with chains. From the shadows beneath its boughs stepped a figure cloaked in darkness, wearing a crown of broken iron. "The tree dies," the voice said, "and when it falls, so too shall the hope of men. You cannot save them, son of Denethor. You are bound to the fate of your house." Faramir drew his sword, but the blade turned to ash in his hand. The figure lifted its arm, and the city crumbled like sand. He woke with a cry. The fire had burned low, and the storm still raged outside. A few men stirred, but none had heard his dream. Faramir sat motionless for a long time, listening to the rain. He thought of his father's last words, of the weight of his name. Then, quietly, he whispered to the dark, "The house of Denethor will not fall again. Not while I yet breathe." The next day dawned grey and cold. They left the ruins behind and rode through the drenched hills until the road leveled into a barren plain. The rain ceased, but a fog rose in its place, thick and blinding. Sound carried strangely in that mist, echoes of hoofbeats, the clatter of metal, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. By midday the fog grew so dense that the men could see no more than a few paces ahead. Baranor rode close to Faramir, unease written upon his face. "This is no natural mist," he said. "I feel eyes upon us." Before Faramir could reply, a cry rang out from the rear of the column. Then another. The sound of steel followed, short, sharp, final. "Circle the wagons," Baranor shouted. The men formed ranks as shapes moved within the fog. Dark forms, swift and silent. Arrows hissed from unseen bows. Horses screamed. Faramir raised his sword, its edge catching what little light there was. "Stand fast!" Out of the mist burst the enemy. Not orcs this time, but men, pale-faced and silent, their eyes hollow, their armor blackened by fire. They moved like sleepwalkers, blades glinting with sickly light. Faramir struck down the first that came near, but when the man fell, he saw no blood, only dust spilling from the wound. "These are not living men," Baranor gasped. The fog thickened, swirling like a living thing. And then, through that haze, came a sound that froze every heart, a low, endless whisper that seemed to echo from within their very thoughts. "Did you think to flee me, steward? The east is mine. The night is mine." The voice of Khamûl rolled through the fog, cold as the breath of winter. His form emerged slowly, vast and formless, the mist itself shaping into his shrouded figure. Around him, the lifeless warriors moved in unison, their blades raised high. Faramir's sword blazed with sudden light, white fire running along its edge. He lifted it above his head, calling out, "By the light of the west I banish you! You have no dominion here!" The wraith's laughter shook the air. "You are your father's son. You think light can drive me away? Light fades. Always." He swept forward, and the fog itself seemed to strike. Men were flung aside, as though by an unseen hand. The fire sputtered and died. Only Faramir stood unmoved, though every part of him burned with cold. He struck once, and his blade met shadow. The light flared again, brighter this time, and the wraith shrieked, a sound that pierced the fog like thunder. The shadow broke, torn apart by the flash. The dead men fell where they stood, lifeless once more. The mist thinned, and the valley was revealed again beneath the grey sky. But the victory was bitter. Half the company lay dead or wounded, and the rest were silent, too weary for words. Faramir looked upon them with sorrow, knowing that each step forward would demand more lives. Still, he raised his sword high, the light upon it flickering but unquenched. "We will not yield," he said. "Not to shadow, not to death. Gondor endures." The men bowed their heads, and for a moment, faint though it was, hope kindled once more. But far away, beyond sight, the wind carried laughter, a whisper that mingled with the sighing of the hills. "The crown will rise again." The days that followed were days of silence. The company rode on through the barren lands where the fog had fallen. The ground cracked beneath their horses' hooves, and no wind stirred the air. The men spoke little. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes haunted by what they had seen in the mist. Many bore wounds that would not heal, though no blade had touched them. Cold burns upon their flesh, as if the shadow itself had reached out to claim them. Faramir rode at their head, his cloak torn and his armor dulled by battle and rain. He did not speak, but his thoughts were dark. Each night the same dream came to him. The white tree withering, its branches breaking beneath the weight of a black crown. And each morning he woke with the echo of that whisper in his ears. The crown will rise again. When the fifth day dawned, they came at last to the shores of the Sea of Nurnen. The waters stretched vast and still before them, dark as polished glass. The land around it was a desolation of salt and stone, where no bird sang and no grass grew. The men halted, weary and uncertain. Baranor approached Faramir, his face grim. "We have reached the end of the road, my lord. The sea lies before us, and behind us only death. What would you have us do?" Faramir looked out over the water. A faint mist hung upon its surface, shifting like pale smoke. Beyond it, at the farthest edge of sight, rose a small island, black and jagged against the horizon. Even from this distance, Faramir felt a chill when his eyes fell upon it. "There," he said softly. "The shadow hides there. Do you not feel it?" Baranor hesitated. "It may be so, but the waters of Nurnen are treacherous. No man has crossed them since the fall of Sauron." "Then we shall be the first," said Faramir. "Gather what wood remains from the wrecks along the shore. We build rafts. At dawn, we cross." The captain bowed but did not argue. All that day they labored, felling what trees still clung to life upon the stony banks, and binding the trunks with rope. The men worked in silence, their faces grim beneath the lowering sky. As the sun sank red behind the hills, the rafts were finished, crude but strong enough to bear them. That night, Faramir walked alone by the shore. The water lapped faintly at his boots, black and cold. He knelt and touched it with his fingers. The chill pierced him to the bone. For a moment, he thought he saw movement beneath the surface, a flicker of pale light, like eyes opening in the depths. He drew back quickly. "So even the waters serve the shadow now," he murmured. When dawn came, pale and lifeless, they set forth. The rafts slid quietly across the still waters, the oars dipping soundlessly. A strange calm lay upon the lake. No wind blew, no ripple stirred. The only sound was the creak of wood and the faint splash of oars. The men did not speak, for fear that their voices would awaken something beneath. Hours passed. The island grew nearer, its cliffs rising sheer from the water, dark and glistening with damp. A narrow inlet cut through the rock, leading into darkness. Faramir's raft was the first to enter. The air grew colder still, and the light dimmed until the water itself seemed to swallow the day. Then, from within the cliffs, they heard it. A sound like breathing, vast and slow, echoing from the depths. The men froze. "Row on," Faramir said quietly. "Whatever waits within, we face it together." The inlet widened suddenly, and they emerged into a cavern so great that the ceiling was lost in shadow. The walls glowed faintly with veins of red crystal, casting a dim light upon the black waters. At the cavern's center rose a great platform of stone, and upon it stood an altar carved with the shapes of crowns and serpents. And there, before the altar, stood Khamûl. His form was clearer now than ever before. No longer the wavering ghost of battle, but tall and terrible, robed in black that shimmered like oil upon water. His helm was gone, and where his face should have been, there was only darkness, deeper than the night. Yet from that void came the gleam of two cold lights, blue as frozen fire. Faramir stepped from the raft onto the stone, his sword already drawn. The sound of his boots upon the wet rock echoed through the cavern. "Your reign is ended, Wraith," he said. "The light has returned to Middle-earth. You have no place here." Khamûl's voice rose like the wind before a storm. "Light? You speak of light, while your king builds his throne upon the bones of the dead. You speak of peace, while your lands rot beneath old wars. You are no more free than I." Faramir stood his ground. "I am bound to no darkness. My will is my own." "Is it?" The Wraith's laughter was hollow and vast. Do you not dream of the crown? Do you not feel it calling in your blood? The same pride that drove your father to madness, the same hunger that built your city upon ruin. The line of the stewards cannot escape the shadow. You are its heir." The word struck deep, for Faramir had indeed felt that pull, the weight of his house's legacy, the whispers of the past that haunted his nights. But he raised his sword higher. "I have seen pride consume my father. I have seen it undone. You cannot sway me with ghosts." Khamûl lifted one hand, and the air trembled. "Then die as he did, burning in your own folly." The cavern shook. The waters rose, black waves surging against the stone. From their depths came shapes, half seen, half formed, spirits of the drowned, their faces pale and twisted. They clawed at the rafts, pulling men into the dark. Cries echoed through the cavern as swords clashed and torches flared. Faramir leapt upon the altar, striking at the wraith with all his strength. His blade met no flesh, yet where it passed, light burst forth, searing the shadows. Khamûl recoiled, his form unraveling like smoke. But the wraith's voice filled the cavern, terrible and unbroken. "You cannot kill what is already dead. The crown will rise, even if all the world burns for it." Faramir's heart surged with fury. "Then let it burn, and let it end." He drove his sword into the altar. The stone split with a sound like thunder. Light erupted from the wound, white and blinding. The water boiled. The wraith screamed. The cavern trembled as though the earth itself cried out. When the light faded, Faramir lay upon the stone, his sword still in his grasp. The altar was gone, shattered to dust. Around him, the waters were still again, their blackness broken by faint glimmers of dawn filtering through the cracks above. Baranor crawled to his side, coughing. "My lord, is it done?" Faramir struggled to his feet. His body ached and his vision swam, but he saw no shadow, no movement, only the still sea. "It is done," he said softly. Yet even as he spoke, the words echoed strangely, as though the cavern itself whispered them back with doubt. He turned to the men who yet lived. "Come, we leave this place. The shadow is broken." And so they did, rowing once more across the silent waters of Nurnen. Behind them, the island sank slowly into mist, until it vanished altogether. But as the sun broke over the mountains, and its light touched the lake, the waves stirred faintly, and deep below, unseen by mortal eyes, something shifted. A single shard of dark metal glinted in the depths, pulsing faintly like a heart still beating. And far to the east, upon the wind, came once more the whisper that would not die. "The crown will rise again." They reached the western shore of the Sea of Nurnen at dusk. The pale sun sank behind the broken hills, painting the waters in streaks of red and gold. The air was heavy with silence, save for the creak of wood and the weary sighs of men. The survivors of Gondor dragged their rafts upon the stones and collapsed beside them, too spent to speak. Faramir stood apart, his cloak torn, his eyes fixed upon the lake. The island lay hidden now beneath mist and distance, but he could still feel its presence, like a memory pressing upon the mind, faint yet unforgotten. His body ached from battle, and the chill of the wraith's touch still lingered in his bones. Yet he lived, and his men lived, and for that he gave thanks in silence. The night came swiftly. Fires were lit, but their glow seemed feeble against the vastness of the dark. The men ate little, for their supplies were nearly gone. Some tended their wounds, others slept uneasily, and a few sat staring across the water, as though expecting the shadow to rise again from its depths. Baranor came to Faramir's side. "The men ask what we shall do now," he said quietly. They have fought bravely, but their strength is spent. If we march north, we may find the old road to Ithilien, though it will be long and perilous." Faramir nodded slowly. "We return to Gondor," he said, "but not to rest. The king must know what we have seen. The shadow is wounded, not slain." Baranor's gaze drifted to the lake. "Do you truly believe it will rise again?" Faramir's answer was long in coming. "I do not know. Yet I have learned that evil seldom dies in full. It lingers, like smoke after fire, waiting for the wind to breathe upon it once more." They said no more. The night deepened, and the stars were faint and cold. A strange unease settled upon the camp. Some of the men began to murmur of voices in the wind, faint and distant. Others swore they saw pale lights moving beneath the water. When dawn came, it was grey and heavy with cloud. The wind rose out of the east, carrying with it the scent of ash and salt. The company set forth once more, following the road that wound between the barren hills. The land grew bleak and twisted as they went. Trees long dead, their branches like claws, and stones that gleamed faintly with an oily sheen. By midday, they came upon a ruin unlike any they had seen before. It stood alone upon a rise of rock, a single tower blackened by age, its top broken, its base half buried in the earth. Around it lay scattered the remains of walls and gates, long fallen. The carvings upon the stones were strange and cruel, depicting men bowed in chains beneath a great burning crown. Faramir halted his men. "We rest here," he said. "The tower will shelter us from the wind." The men obeyed, though uneasily. The place felt wrong, as though it watched them. Even the horses shied, snorting and stamping. But Faramir entered the ruin without fear. He climbed the cracked steps to the tower's hall, where the roof had fallen away, and the sky could be seen through the shattered stones. There, upon the floor, he found an old book, its pages blackened and stiff with age. The letters were faded, but some could still be read. He brushed away the dust and traced the words with his gloved hand. "He who wears the crown of ash shall not die, for his spirit is bound in the dark waters until the hand of the west takes up the flame anew." Faramir read the words twice, his heart growing cold. Then he turned the page and found drawn there a sigil, the same crown of shards he had shattered upon the altar. Baranor's voice called from below, "My lord, riders approach." Faramir rose swiftly and went to the doorway. Across the plain to the south, dark figures moved through the dust. At first he thought them enemies, but as they drew near, he saw the white tree of Gondor upon their banners. His heart lifted. When the riders reached the ruin, their captain dismounted and knelt. "Lord Faramir," he said, "we were sent by King Elessar. Word reached us of unrest in the east. Praise be, we have found you alive." Faramir clasped the man's arm. "You come in good hour. Much has passed, and more yet to come." The captain's brow furrowed. "We have seen signs of battle upon the plains, and strange lights in the night. What evil stirs here?" Faramir looked toward the east, where the faint outline of the lake shimmered beyond the haze. "A wraith," he said. "One of the 9, the second of their number. He sought to raise again the dominion of the shadow. We struck him down, but his spirit endures." The men murmured in fear, crossing themselves. But the captain raised his head. "Then we will bring you home, my lord. The king will know how to meet this darkness." That night they camped beneath the walls of the ruin. For the first time in many days, Faramir allowed himself to rest. He dreamed again, but the dream was different. He stood upon the walls of Minas Tirith, and before him lay the fields of Pelennor, green and bright beneath the sun. The air was filled with the songs of birds and the laughter of children. Yet in the distance, far to the east, a single dark cloud rose upon the horizon. A voice spoke beside him, calm, deep, and familiar. "You have done well, my friend." Faramir turned and saw the king, tall and bright in his mail, the crown of Gondor upon his brow. Aragorn's face was grave but kind. "You have carried the light into the darkness," he said, "but the work is not yet done. Shadows grow again in the corners of the world, and we must guard against them always." Faramir bowed his head. "Then I will guard, my liege, as long as I have breath." When he woke, the dawn was clear for the first time in many weeks. The storm had passed, and sunlight spilled across the plain. The air was clean and cool. The men rose with lighter hearts, and even the horses stood calm. They broke camp and rode westward, leaving the ruin behind. Yet as Faramir looked back one last time, he thought he saw movement atop the tower, a flicker of black against the sky, like the shadow of a wing. He said nothing, but his hand went to the hilt of his sword. For though the land seemed quiet now, he knew well that evil seldom sleeps. It hides, it waits, and when men grow content, it stirs again. The company rode on toward the White City, and the sun rose higher behind them. But far across the sea of Nurnen, deep beneath the waters, the shard of the crown pulsed once more, faint as a heartbeat. And the wind, sighing through the east, carried with it that eternal murmur, soft, cold, and patient. The crown will rise again. The journey back to Gondor was long and heavy with silence. The men of the east rode wearily through the plains of Mordor, their eyes ever turning to the shadowed horizon, half expecting the wraith to rise again from behind them. Though the sun shone now, pale and thin, it gave little warmth to the hearts of the weary. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though it too listened for the whisper of the dark. Faramir led them, his cloak drawn tight against the cold wind that followed them from the east. He did not rest easily. His dreams still carried him back to that black island, to the broken altar and the crown of shards that pulsed like a living heart. Even now, when he closed his eyes, he felt the chill of that place upon his skin. He would wake before dawn, his hand upon his sword, his breath caught in his throat, listening for footsteps that were never there. They passed through the dead fields of Gorgoroth, where the earth was cracked and scorched, and no bird dared to fly. Here, once, the armies of Sauron had gathered. Here, once, the mountains had echoed with the screams of war. Now there was only silence, and the wind that whispered across the waste. Baranor rode beside his lord, his face drawn and grave. "The men are tired, my lord," he said softly. "They need rest and hope, if there is any left to give them." Faramir nodded. "We shall rest when we cross the Morgai. There the air is cleaner, and the stars may yet be seen without veil. Until then, they must endure." Baranor hesitated. "And you, my lord, you have not closed your eyes for 2 nights. The men see it. They fear what hunts your dreams." Faramir's gaze did not waver from the horizon. "Let them not fear for me. The darkness I bear is mine alone." By nightfall they reached the edge of the Morgai, the dark hills that bordered the plains. There they made camp among the stones, kindling small fires that flickered like lonely stars in the gloom. For the first time in days, the sky above them was clear, and through the veil of ash they glimpsed the stars of the west, faint but steadfast. The men spoke in low voices, and some even smiled. The nearness of their homeland filled them with new resolve. Yet Faramir did not share in their ease. He sat apart, upon a boulder overlooking the plains and watched the darkness to the east. The wind had fallen still, but in its place came another sound, a faint, rhythmic whisper, like a voice carried over water. The crown will rise again. He closed his eyes, but the words didn't fade. They throbbed like the beating of a heart. He thought of the book he had found in the ruined tower, of the words written in its blackened pages. He who wears the crown of ash shall not die. Faramir rose and drew his sword. The blade shone faintly in the starlight, its edge keen and pale. If he comes again, he murmured to the night, then I will meet him once more, until the end of days. But the night passed without attack. The dawn that followed was bright, the air cool and clean. The company broke camp and continued westward, and for a time it seemed that the darkness had truly been left behind. By the 7th day, they reached the Vale of Lithlad, where the first green shoots of grass had begun to grow among the stones. The men laughed for the first time since the battle, marveling that life could take root even in such desolation. The sight brought tears to Faramir's eyes, though he spoke no word. When the sun was high, they halted by a stream that ran clear and cold from the mountains. The horses drank deeply, and the men washed the dust from their faces. It was there that a rider approached from the west, his banner white and bearing the sigil of the White Tree. The men rose in wonder as the rider drew near, for it was one of the king's own messengers. He dismounted before Faramir and bowed low. "Lord Steward," he said, "I bring tidings from Minas Tirith. The king has heard of your battle in the east. He bids you return swiftly, for he fears the shadow that lingers in Mordor grows bold again." Faramir inclined his head. "Tell the king I come as swiftly as the road will bear me. The shadow is not ended, but it is broken." The messenger's eyes darkened. "There are whispers even in the city, my lord. Some say the dead stir again in the lands beyond the Anduin. Strange lights have been seen upon the mountains at night." Faramir's hand tightened upon the reins. "Then it begins anew," he murmured. That evening they rode hard, passing beneath the dark slopes of Efelduath. As the sun set, the peaks glowed red as embers, and the wind carried the faint smell of smoke. It was a grim reminder that Mordor never truly slept. When they reached the pass of Cirith Ungol, they found the ruins of the old watchtower, standing black against the fading sky. Faramir ordered the men to rest there one last night before descending into Ithilien. The fires were lit, and the company settled in the shadow of the broken walls. But Faramir did not sleep. He climbed the steps to the tower's summit, where the wind howled through the cracks. From there, he looked out upon the lands of Gondor, lying far below like a dream, green and gold beneath the stars. For the first time since his journey began, he allowed himself a moment of peace. He thought of Éowyn, of her laughter and the quiet strength in her eyes. He thought of the children of Ithilien, who now played in fields that had once been torn by war. He thought of all that had been rebuilt from ruin, and all that yet could be lost. "Not again," he whispered. "Never again." The wind rose suddenly, carrying with it a distant sound, a faint, shuddering cry that echoed across the mountains. Faramir stiffened. It was no bird, no beast. It was the voice of the Wraith, thin and terrible, carried from afar. "You cannot destroy what was never yours to begin with. The crown belongs to all who hunger, and men will always hunger." Lightning flashed far to the east, splitting the horizon with white fire. For a heartbeat, Faramir thought he saw a shape in the clouds, a figure tall and crowned, its form made of shadow and flame. Then it was gone, swallowed by the storm. Baranor found him there at dawn, his cloak whipping in the wind. "My lord," he said quietly, "the men are ready. The road to Ithilien lies clear." Faramir turned, his face pale in the new light. "Then let us go home. But send word to the king that the east is not at peace. The darkness stirs again, and its hand reaches farther than we feared." They descended from the mountains, the road winding before them like a pale ribbon. Behind them, the black peaks of Mordor faded into the mist, yet the wind still carried faint echoes of that whisper, so soft that only Faramir could hear it. "The crown will rise again." He said nothing, but as he rode, he lifted his gaze to the west, where the white city awaited, shining faint against the dawn. And though he could not see it yet, he felt in his heart that light still endured there, and would endure, even when the shadows gathered once more. The white walls of Minas Tirith rose before them at last, gleaming faintly through the mists of early dawn. The weary company crossed the Pelennor fields, where spring had begun to bloom once more. The scars of war still marked the land, but new grass had sprung between the furrows, and the scent of growing things filled the air. The men lifted their heads at the sight of the city, their hearts stirred by its steadfast towers and the banners that fluttered upon the high walls. Faramir gazed upon it long, his heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. How bright the city seemed, and yet how fragile in its peace. He could almost forget for a moment the darkness that clung to his soul, the whisper that had followed him from the east, like a shadow he could not cast away. As they neared the gates, the guards of the White Tower came forth to meet them. The trumpets sounded clear and bright, echoing across the plain. The men dismounted, and word spread swiftly through the city that the steward had returned. Crowds gathered upon the streets to see them enter, men and women, old and young, their faces alight with hope. But Faramir saw, among their joy, the lines of weariness that peace had not erased. The city was healing, but slowly. Many had lost kin in the wars, and though the years had softened the grief, it had not yet faded. When the company reached the 7th level, the great doors of the citadel stood open, and upon the steps of the Tower of Ecthelion stood King Elessar himself. His eyes, bright and keen as ever, met Faramir's with warmth and concern. "Welcome home, my friend," said Aragorn, taking him by the arm. "You have been long gone, and my heart has been heavy with worry. I see the road has not been kind to you." Faramir bowed his head. "My lord, the east is restless. The shadow has not yet passed from those lands. A remnant of the Nine stirs there still." At those words, a hush fell upon all who stood nearby. The king's face grew grave. "Tell me all," he said, and together they entered the Hall of Kings. There, before the throne, Faramir recounted the tale of their journey, the ambushes in the marshes, the battle upon the lake, the wraith that called itself Khamûl, and the broken crown of ash. As he spoke, the light from the tall windows dimmed, and it seemed to all who listened that the shadow of that dark spirit passed once more across their minds. When he had finished, Aragorn sat long in thought. At last he said, "The ring was destroyed, yet evil does not die so easily. It changes its form and waits for the hour when men forget." Faramir nodded. "I fear that hour may be nearer than we wish. The crown may rise again if we do not guard against it." The king rose. "Then we shall not rest. I will summon the council. The captains of Gondor, the wise of the north, even the lords of Rohan. If the shadow stirs again, all the west must stand as one." Faramir bowed. "My sword is yours, my king, as it ever was." That night, the city was alight with quiet joy, for the steward had returned from the darkness. Yet within the tower there was no rest. Messengers rode forth beneath the stars, bearing the king's call to every corner of the realm. When the council gathered 2 days later, they met in the high chamber of the tower, where the white banners hung still and the air was cool and bright. Beside the king sat Faramir, and with them were Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, Éomer king of Rohan, and Gimli and Legolas, who had come from the north at the king's summons. Aragorn spoke of the signs that had come to Gondor, the tremors in the east, the fading of the stars, and the dark dream that haunted his steward. When he had finished, there was silence for a time. Then Gimli struck the haft of his axe upon the floor. If it is war the shadow seeks, then war it shall have. Let the dwarves of Erebor stand with Gondor, as we did before. Legolas's eyes gleamed like green fire. And the elves will not stand idle. The forests still remember the cries of the Nazgûl. We shall not suffer their kind to rise again. Éomer laid his hand upon his sword. The riders of the Mark will answer the call, though our numbers are few. The East has long been our foe, and we do not forget. Aragorn inclined his head. Then so shall it be. Yet we do not ride to conquer, but to cleanse. The darkness must be driven out once and for all. When the council was ended, and the lords had gone to make ready, Faramir remained with the king. They stood together upon the balcony that overlooked the city. The wind stirred their cloaks, and far below, the lamps of Minas Tirith shone like 1,000 stars upon the plain. "The world has known peace but a short while," Faramir said softly. "I had hoped it would endure beyond my years." "It will endure," said Aragorn, "but peace is not the absence of shadow. It is the courage to face it when it returns. And it always returns in some form or another." Faramir was silent for a time. Then he said, "There is one thing I have not spoken of. When I broke the crown upon the altar, I felt something pass into me. Not darkness, but the memory of it. It lies in my heart still like a cold ember." The king looked upon him, his eyes full of understanding. "The shadow leaves its mark upon all who walk through it. But you are stronger than it, my friend. The courage of your house runs deep." They stood together until the stars wheeled high above them, and though neither spoke it, both knew that the road ahead would be long and perilous once more. Days turned to weeks as the armies of the West gathered. Messengers came from all lands, elves from Ithilien, dwarves from the glittering caves, and riders from the Mark. The forges of the city blazed anew, and the sound of hammers filled the air. Yet amid the noise and the bustle, a strange unease grew. The nights were no longer still. Sometimes, in the small hours, the sentries upon the walls swore they heard voices upon the wind, faint cries that came from the direction of the east. And once, upon the eve of their departure, a watchman upon the highest tower cried out that he had seen a light upon the horizon, a red glow, pulsing like a heartbeat, far beyond the mountains of shadow. When word reached the king, he stood long at the window, looking eastward. "The fire stirs again," he said. Faramir joined him, his hand upon the pommel of his sword. "Then we shall meet it once more, my lord. We have walked through darkness before, and we will not falter now." The king's eyes were bright with resolve. "No, we shall not falter, for the light of the West is not so easily quenched." And so it was that Gondor prepared once more for war, not of conquest or pride, but of endurance. The armies gathered beneath banners of white and silver, and though the shadow loomed far off, the hearts of men were steadfast. Yet as the wind swept down from the east, cold and sharp, it carried with it a whisper that none could silence. "The crown will rise again." Winter's breath swept through the white city, stirring the banners of the king and making the towers gleam like pale silver in the cold light. The forge fires burned bright upon the lower levels, and the sound of hammer upon anvil echoed through the streets, for Gondor prepared once more for war. Yet though the city's heart was strong, a quiet unease lay beneath its walls. Rumors whispered through the markets and taverns that the east had begun to burn again, that strange lights had been seen upon the plains of Mordor, and that the shadow of a lost crown stirred in the depths of the earth. Faramir, steward of Gondor, rose before dawn each day, his mind restless and his heart troubled. He dreamed still of the crown, its dark shards scattered like coals upon the ground, and of the cold voice that would not leave his memory. The crown will rise again. The words clung to him as frost clings to stone. He walked often through the gardens of the citadel, where the white tree stood tall and glimmering, even in the dim light of winter. The sight of it gave him comfort, yet its leaves trembled with each passing wind, and in that trembling he thought he saw a warning. On one such morning, the king found him there, standing beneath the boughs of the tree. Aragorn wore no crown, only a simple cloak of grey, yet he seemed as noble and unshaken as the mountain that rose above the city. "You are troubled, my friend," said the king, his voice gentle but firm. "Your eyes turn always eastward, even in the light of day." Faramir bowed his head. "The shadow lingers, my lord. I cannot shake the feeling that it watches still. I have seen its hand at work, in dreams and in the hearts of men." Aragorn's gaze was steady. "The Wraith's power is broken. You yourself saw it fall." "I saw its form destroyed," Faramir replied softly, "but not its will. The evil that drove it does not die so easily. It is patient. It waits." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the branches above them, and a single leaf fell, spinning down between them to rest upon the white stones. At last, Aragorn said, "Then we must not wait as it does. If there is a fire yet burning in the east, we will go to meet it before it spreads. The armies are ready. Rohan has pledged her riders, and the north sends word of aid." Faramir's heart lifted at his king's resolve. "Then I will ride at your side, my lord, as I did in the days of old." "You will," said Aragorn, and his hand fell upon Faramir's shoulder. "But not as a soldier alone. You have walked where few have walked. You have seen what lies behind the veil of shadow. If this enemy is what you fear, we will need your wisdom more than your blade." That night, beneath a sky of pale stars, the horns of Gondor rang across the plains. The armies of the west gathered once more, the banners of the white tree, the horse of Rohan, and the swan of Dol Amroth, all flying together in the chill wind. The men's hearts were strong, but each felt the weight of what they faced. They did not ride for conquest, nor for gold, but to stand against the darkness that would not die. Faramir rode beside the king as they passed through the gates of the city. Behind them came their captains, and behind the captains the long host of Gondor, thousands of torches moving like a river of light into the night. Their road led them east, through the fields of Ithilien, where the trees grew bare and silent. Once, this land had been Faramir's charge, a place of peace and green renewal. Now it lay cold and empty, as though the earth itself waited. As they made camp upon the third night, scouts returned with word that the borders of Mordor were no longer silent. Smoke rose from the plains, and strange fires burned beneath the mountains. Faramir stood before the map laid out upon the table in the king's tent, tracing the lines of the mountains with his gloved hand. "The island upon the Sea of Nurnen is gone," he said. but I fear its heart was not destroyed. The Wraith's power may have passed into the earth itself. The old texts spoke of such things, spirits bound to their strongholds, waiting for a will great enough to call them forth again. Then it is not merely Khamûl we face, said Aragorn. It is what lies behind him, the echo of Sauron's will. Faramir nodded. And it will seek a vessel through which to rise. A man's heart, perhaps, or a king's crown. The king's eyes grew distant. There are many crowns in the world, but only one that all hearts seek, the crown of dominion. Power, rule, mastery. That hunger never sleeps. As they spoke, a cold wind swept through the tent, extinguishing the candles. The men started, for though no storm had touched their camp, the air turned sharp and biting. And faintly, through the darkness, there came a whisper, not loud, but clear enough to chill the blood. The crown will rise again. The torches flared anew, though none had touched them. Faramir and Aragorn exchanged a long glance, and the king's jaw hardened. It taunts us, he said, but it is afraid. Shadows do not whisper when they are strong. They strike. Then it will strike soon, said Faramir. The next day, the army marched again, their banners rippling in a sullen wind. The nearer they drew to Mordor, the darker the skies became. By the time they reached the plains of Gorgoroth, the sun was but a pale disk behind a curtain of ash. The land lay broken and scarred, yet from beneath the cracks there came a dull, red glow, as though the fires of the earth were waking once more. When night fell, the glow deepened, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. From the distance came a sound like thunder, but it was no storm. It was the sound of drums, deep and slow, echoing from the mountains. The men grew restless. Even the horses stamped and tossed their heads. Faramir walked among them, speaking words of courage, reminding them of the White City, of their homes and the light they fought to protect. Yet in his heart, he felt the pull of the darkness growing stronger, calling to him as it had before. He climbed a rise and looked eastward. There, upon the horizon, he saw it, the faint shape of a crown, formed from the smoke and fire that rose above the plains. Its points gleamed red against the night, and beneath it, something moved. A figure, vast and terrible, formed from shadow and flame. It was not the wraith he had known. It was greater, more complete, a thing reborn from hatred itself. Khamûl had returned. The drums grew louder. The very air seemed to tremble. Faramir drew his sword, its light flashing in the darkness. "The crown rises," he whispered. "Then let the light of the west rise to meet it." He turned to the camp below, where the torches of Gondor burned in defiance against the night. The hour had come. The final battle between the shadow that would not die and the light that would not yield was about to begin. And though the wind carried once more that dreadful whisper, "The crown will rise again," Faramir's heart was steadfast, for he knew that even in the blackest night, the stars endure. The plains of Gorgoroth were aflame. The earth groaned beneath the tread of armies, and the air was thick with ash and smoke. Upon the darkened horizon, fire leapt from the cracks of the mountains, staining the sky with red. The drums of the east thundered from the depths of Mordor, rolling across the barren land like the heartbeat of the world itself. Faramir stood upon the high ridge with the king beside him. Before them stretched the gathered hosts of the west, Gondor's white banners, the horsemen of Rohan, and the swan knights of Dol Amroth. Thousands of torches flickered in the growing dark, their light like a sea of stars against the blackened waste. Yet for all their might, the men of the west were silent. They could feel the shadow pressing down upon them and the weight of dread that came before the storm. Across the plain, the armies of the east assembled. Orcs and Easterlings, their ranks endless, their armor black and red as dried blood. Above them, upon a hill of stone, there moved a figure vast and terrible. It wore no crown of gold, but one of molten fire. The air shimmered around it with heat and shadow. Khamûl had come again, reborn in wrath. A cry rose from the ranks of the east, a cry not of men, but of things long buried. It was the sound of vengeance, of hate unending. The ground trembled, and a black wind swept over the plain, carrying with it the voice that had haunted Faramir's dreams. The crown will rise again. Faramir's heart clenched at the sound. He looked to the king. He has taken form. The fire has given him flesh once more. Aragorn's eyes were hard and bright. Then the fire will also be his doom. He raised his sword high, the blade that had been reforged from the shards of Narsil. Its light broke through the gloom, clear and white as starlight. The men of Gondor lifted their voices in answer, and the horns of Rohan answered them, long and fierce. So the battle was joined. The two hosts surged together upon the plain with a sound like the sea in storm. The clash of steel rang through the air, mingled with the cries of men and the screeching of beasts. Faramir rode at the head of the southern line, his sword flashing as he cut through the tide of foes. Around him, his men fought with the courage of the desperate, for they knew there would be no retreat. The enemy was endless, pouring forth from fissures in the earth, driven by a power unseen. Each time the men of the West broke their ranks, more rose in their place. And above the chaos, Khamûl's voice called, cold and terrible, "You fight for ashes. The world belongs to flame." Lightning burst from the sky, striking the field with white fire. Where it touched, men and orcs alike fell, their bodies consumed by light. Faramir's horse reared, and he leapt from the saddle, landing amidst the wreckage. His blade sang as it met the black armor of an Easterling captain. The two clashed fiercely, but Faramir's strength did not falter. He struck the man down and turned toward the hill where the wraith's fire burned. Around him, the battle raged like a storm, yet his path seemed guided by something beyond Whitlan. A pull, dark and inescapable. Aragorn's horn sounded from the northern flank, and the king's banner rose high amidst the struggle. He fought like one possessed, Andúril shining with a light that scattered shadow. Wherever he passed, the servants of the Wraith fell back, shrieking. Yet even the king could not reach the heart of the storm where Khamûl stood. Faramir pressed forward through the ranks, his mind fixed upon that blazing crown. Each step brought him nearer to the Wraith, and with each step, the whisper in his mind grew louder. "You are mine, steward. The blood of your house is bound to the flame." He stumbled, clutching his head, as visions flooded his sight. The white tower falling into ruin, the tree consumed by fire, the river Anduin running red. He heard his father's voice crying out from the pyre, and for a moment, the weight of his name crushed him. Then another voice rose within him, clear and steadfast. It was Éowyn's voice, though she was far away. "Faramir, of all the men of Gondor, you are not one who yields to fear." He lifted his head. The fire of the Wraith burned before him now, towering and alive. Khamûl stood upon the black hill, his form wreathed in flame and shadow, his sword like molten iron. "Come, son of Denethor," the Wraith thundered. "Come claim the crown that your fathers desired. You and I are not so different. You would rule in the light, I in the dark, but both crave dominion. Bow to me, and Gondor shall be spared." Faramir raised his sword. Gondor needs no master, least of all one born of shadow. The wraith's laughter split the air. Then die as your father did, defiant, but undone. He struck, and the hill itself shuddered. Flame burst around them, and the ground split at Faramir's feet. But he leapt forward, his blade meeting the wraith's in a clash that shook the sky. The fire burned his armor, seared his flesh. Yet he didn't falter. He remembered the White City, the laughter of his people, the face of his wife, all the things that the shadow could never touch. "You have no power here," he said through his pain, "for hope does not die, even in Mordor." Then he drove his sword deep into the wraith's chest. There was a sound like thunder breaking the world. Light burst from the wound, white, pure, and terrible. The crown of flame shattered, and the fire of Khamûl was torn apart, scattering into the wind. The dark armies faltered, and a great cry rose from the men of the west as the tide of the battle turned. Aragorn's horn sounded again, and the light of Andúril blazed high, cutting through the last of the shadow. The enemy broke and fled, their ranks collapsing into ruin. When the noise of battle faded, Faramir lay upon the ground at the foot of the hill. His sword was blackened, his armor scorched, but he was alive. The king came to him, his face pale with weariness, and knelt beside him. "It is done," Aragorn said softly. Faramir opened his eyes. "The shadow? Gone, for now," the king replied. "Its master is broken." Faramir managed a faint smile. "Then perhaps peace may truly come." Aragorn clasped his hand. "If peace can come anywhere, it will come here. Because of you." They looked together upon the plain, where the fires of Mordor were dying at last. The red glow faded, leaving behind only smoke and silence. The wind that swept across the field was cold, but it carried the scent of rain, clean and living. Faramir closed his eyes, and for the first time in many months, the whisper was gone. No voice haunted his dreams. Only the sound of the wind remained. But far to the east, beyond the mountains, where no light could reach, the ashes of the wraith's crown lay buried deep within the earth. And though the fire had died, one ember still smoldered faintly, waiting for breath. For evil, like fire, needs only a spark to live again. And somewhere in the dark, unseen, the whisper began anew, soft, patient, eternal. The crown will rise again. The field of battle lay silent beneath a grey dawn. The smoke of war drifted across the plains of Gorgoroth, curling upward like spirits seeking the heavens. No cry of orc or man disturbed the hush that followed victory. The fires of Mordor were quenched at last, and the dark crown that had risen once more was shattered. Yet amid that silence, there was both triumph and sorrow, for peace in Middle-earth was always dearly bought. Faramir stood upon the black hill where the wraith had fallen. His armor was scorched, and his cloak torn, yet his bearing was proud. The light of the morning touched his face, and for the first time in many years, warmth broke through the shadow that had clung to his heart. Around him, the soldiers of Gondor moved slowly, tending the wounded, gathering their dead. The banners of the White Tree hung heavy with ash, but they still waved upon the wind, unbroken. King Elessar came to him, his own armor marred by flame and battle. He looked long upon the steward, and in his eyes was the deep understanding that only those who had stood together in darkness could share. "The shadow is ended," said the king. "Mordor has no power left to rise again." Faramir shook his head slightly. "Its land may be broken, my lord, but darkness does not die. It lingers in the hearts of men, and in the ruins of their pride." Aragorn placed a hand upon his shoulder. then it is the task of the living to guard against its return. And none are better suited to that duty than you, my friend." They stood together upon the ridge, watching as the sun climbed higher over the black mountains. Its light fell upon the plains, revealing the full ruin of the enemy's host. The bodies of orcs lay scattered like leaves after a storm, and the great beasts of war that had once served the east now lay fallen, their chains broken. The drums of Mordor were silent. "See how the light drives out even the memory of their strength," said Aragorn. "Evil devours itself in the end." Faramir nodded, though his thoughts were far away. "Yet I cannot help but wonder if we have seen the last of it. The crown was shattered twice, my lord, but its ashes remain. Evil is cunning. It can hide in the smallest ember, waiting for the wind to feed it once more." Aragorn smiled faintly. "Then we shall be the wind that smothers it, not feeds it." The king turned to his captains, issuing orders to gather the wounded and prepare the return to Gondor. But Faramir lingered a while longer, gazing eastward. The wind carried the scent of stone and ash, but beneath it was another, faint and clean, the promise of rain. He drew a long breath and let it fill his lungs. For the first time, the land of Mordor seemed less a tomb and more a place awaiting rebirth. By evening, the camp was struck, and the armies of the west began their slow march homeward. The road through the mountains was long and perilous, yet their hearts were lighter than when they came. Songs rose among the men, songs of victory, of courage, of those who had fallen and would not return. Faramir rode beside the king at the head of the column. As they crossed the ash plains, they passed the ruins of Barad-dûr, now little more than a heap of blackened stone. No light glimmered there, and no voice rose from its depths. The very air around it was still and cold, as if the land itself mourned its long captivity. "The fortress is gone," Faramir said quietly, "and with it, the memory of the Eye." "Let it remain gone," said Aragorn. "Time will cover these wounds, as it has before. The grass will grow again, and one day the children of men will walk these fields without fear." Faramir looked upon him and smiled faintly. "That is a hope worth fighting for." They rode on, and behind them, the fires of Mordor faded into the distance. The mountains that had once imprisoned the land now seemed to fall away, and before them stretched the green hills of Ithilien, washed clean by rain. When they reached the borders of Gondor, the people came out to greet them. Bells rang from the towers, and flowers were cast upon the road. The weary soldiers bowed their heads as they entered the white city, their banners shining in the sunlight. Éowyn awaited them upon the steps of the citadel, her hair bright as gold beneath the sky. When Faramir dismounted, she ran to him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Your heart led you back to me," she said softly, taking his hand. "And it shall never stray again," he answered. The king and queen stood beside them, watching as the people cheered. And though many wounds remained to be healed, both upon the land and in the hearts of men, there was a peace that day that none had felt since the ring was destroyed. That night, a feast was held in the great hall. The torches burned bright, and the air was filled with song. Yet even in the midst of rejoicing, Faramir found himself drawn to the high balcony overlooking the city. The moon rose above Mindolluin, casting her silver light upon the white tree, whose leaves stirred softly in the breeze. Aragorn joined him there, and for a time they stood in silence. "What do you see?" asked the king. Faramir looked eastward, where the faint line of the mountains lay against the horizon. "I see the end of one age," he said, "and the beginning of another. The shadow has passed, but we must remain watchful." For if the crown of the wraiths can rise again, so too can the pride of men. Aragorn nodded slowly. That is why Gondor needs its steward. Faramir turned to him, his eyes shining in the moonlight. And its king, he said. They clasped hands, and the bond between them, born in the fires of war, tempered by loss and courage, was stronger than ever. Below them, the city slept in peace. The bells had fallen silent, the torches burned low, and the stars shone bright above the towers. The white tree swayed gently in the wind, its silver leaves whispering a song of hope. But far to the east, where the land still smoldered beneath the mountains, a single glimmer of red light flickered in the darkness. It pulsed once, faint and slow, like the heartbeat of a dying flame. Then the wind rose, sweeping across the waste, carrying with it a voice so soft it might have been mistaken for the sighing of the earth itself. The crown will rise again. And though none in Gondor heard it, the echo of that whisper passed into the night and was gone. Yet even in its vanishing, it left a promise that the struggle between light and shadow would never truly end, but would live forever in the hearts of those who walked beneath the sun. Still, as dawn came once more to Minas Tirith, golden and clear, the light of the west shone undimmed. The white tree stirred, and the king stood upon his tower, gazing eastward, his hand upon the hilt of Andoril. For though the world would know darkness again, it would always rise to meet it. And in that rising, there would be hope.